paper reports that two of the male prostitutes were given a late-night tour of the White House last year.
I think I'm entitled. You want answers.
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Nick Bryant Podcast. Today, my guest is author Michael McCarthy. Michael has written a number of books, and his latest offering is called Follow the Money: How China Bought the World. How you doing today, Michael?
I cannot complain, and if I did, I'm sure no one would care.
Well, you know, I might care.
I'm doing great.
Michael lives in Vancouver, which is probably my favorite city in North America. I've got a cousin and an aunt that live there, and I love Vancouver. Spent a lot of my time in the Northwest.
Yeah, good.
So, Michael, tell us a little bit about Follow the Money.
How much time we got? Okay, start at the beginning, or what would you like?
Go for it.
Okay, well, let me just do a mini bio here because it's quite relevant, actually, to the reason why this book was published. I started off in media many years ago in radio, worked my way up to the top, to the talk show level. Switched over to print, did mostly investigative journalism, those long features that newspapers and magazines used to run before they ran out of money. And along the way, I've always been an explorer. Ever since I was a teenager, I've been exploring the world in one way, shape, form, or another. And when I became a senior reporter, I got to the point where I learned how to do press trips. So I've been the lucky recipient of quite a few press trips around the world. I lost track many years ago of how many hundreds of trips I've done, but I've been lucky enough to visit all of the places that are described in my book. So you could call me a travel writer, but this book is not really a travel book. Follow the Money: How China Bought the World is sort of an expose of geo-economic politics to explain how certain people have become so filthy, stinking rich, and a lot of us are going the other direction. And so it's a combination of history, geography, political expose, behind the scenes, like, how did we end up in this situation where so many people can't afford to buy a house, haven't got a job. And on the other side of the world, some people that used to be known as enemies have become extremely rich.
Well, China is certainly churning out billionaires these days. How did that happen?
Well, it's very difficult to say in just a mouthful. There's a couple of key dates that I would like to refer to. Probably the most recent, 1971, and then before that, 1840. And I think that particular history of 1840 is essential to understanding the book. So if you allow me, I'll just get into that for just a moment. 1840, okay. 1840, in and around that time, inventor James Watt got the patent on the steam engine, launching the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain. And within a very short number of years, Great Britain became an industrial powerhouse, factories turning out vast number of manufactured goods, railroads, a huge navy exporting it all around the planet. And just like China today has become extremely polluted, its air anyway, from cranking out all this carbon dioxide from its factories. And the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, it was the waterways that got heavily polluted to the point where people switched to beer. You couldn't drink the water. And very soon, in short order, the robber barons that owned all these factories discovered productivity was slipping because people were drunk all the time. There was a rumor going around that there was this strange exotic beverage called chai, that the Chinese call chai. And the industrialists hired a Scottish mercenary named Robert Fortune to don a disguise, sneak into China upon pain of death, and bring back the secrets of tea horticulture. The British fell in love with tea to an incredible extent, whereby they almost went bankrupt buying it in such volume because the Chinese would only accept silver and gold, no trade, no barter, no exchange. And this causes severe economic balance in Europe. So the British found a solution. They took their navy, they went over to India and harvested all this opium and ran it down the Chinese throats in gunboats, starting a war, which the British won. And the concessions.
Boxer Rebellion.
Yes, and the reward to the British was they got to trade with the Chinese, and they ended up with Hong Kong, which became their main port and defense headquarters for their military. And the Chinese have been very angry ever since what the British did to them by addicting them all to this poisonous substance called opium. So jump forward a couple of hundred years, bring us to today, and we'll get into that in a minute. I think everyone can relate more to 1971 when Richard Nixon was president. And there was a lot of people sniffing around, his background. He wasn't called Tricky Dick for nothing. And this is before, of course, he was charged with crimes such as Watergate and all the other crimes he and his gang got away with. So 1971, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, on a trade mission to Pakistan, made a secret visit to visit the great madman and killer Mao Zedong. And there are words like secret all the way through this book that I didn't know when I started sticking my nose into all this stuff. It's all public now. It's all there if you go looking for it. My job as a journalist is to piece all the pieces together, connect the dots, and create a picture that people can understand. But look, the Americans have been fighting communism since Korea and Vietnam for 30 years. And all of a sudden, Kissinger goes over and says to Mao, there's a lot of money to be made here. Why don't we just suddenly become buddies? And that's basically where all it started in 1971. Kissinger, did not make it public at that time. No one knew that they were planning this, but they were busy rounding up corporate support to offload offshore, get rid of millions of good-paying American jobs.
And how was that accomplished?
That's a follow-up book. I'm going to have to write that. And I was alive at the time. I wasn't following closely, but I think the word offshoring was quickly replaced with that killing word globalization. We're all a global village now. We're all going to get together and we're going to manufacture stuff up over there, and they'll all be peasants and working for peanuts, and we'll all get rich over here. So people bought into that. And the corporate American structure bought into it very heavily, starting in 1978 when Mao finally died and Deng Xiaoping became the leader and agreed to allow market capitalism.
And so the Americans and the Chinese got together and sang Kumbaya. And how did that change the industrial dynamic of the two nations? I believe that, China is certainly number one when it comes to manufacturing, but I believe that the United States is number two, or was number two up until a couple of years ago.
So it depends, I guess, how you define manufacturing, light manufacturing versus heavy manufacturing. You might have noticed that all the heavy manufacturing, like steel mills, went to China and they went to India and other places. But how did this so-called relationship change the world economic order? Well, under Mao, between 1958 and 62, in the Great Leap Forward, he tried to industrialize the country and change it from an agrarian state. And he ordered everybody in the whole country to put up a kiln, a steel mill in their collective, in their commune. And they basically denuded the entire country of forests, and they were forced to throw in their pots and pans and woks and everything else. And 100% of those steel mills failed. They couldn't produce anything more than pig iron or slag, absolutely worthless. And during the course of time, people were not allowed to grow their own food, to become farmers, which they'd been for 5,000 years. And depending on your estimates, up to 35 million people starved to death, which didn't bother, Mao whatsoever.
Mao was on the genocidal side.
a bit on the genocide side. He
People
killed more
ask me
people.
who killed more people, Mao or Stalin, and I generally say, well, I think that's a jump ball.
Yeah, really. And you can throw Stalin in there as well, because the initial idea coming from America was for Mao to replicate the gulags that Stalin invented. Just arrest everybody, throw them in prison, and have them work for free in factories, which is what all that Mao did. Because you know that old joke about communism, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. You know, communism doesn't work. People in China were starving to death. So all that Mao had to do was arrest people and put them into these special economic zones in southern China. And America did everything else: the planning, the funding, the strategy, the investment, the works.
And you're talking about the Cultural Revolution.
No, Cultural Revolution is a different thing. That Mao also did that, along with the Great Leap Forward, as a way of having his iron control over the population. Basically, the Cultural Revolution was about destroy the museums, destroy the schools, make the school teachers work in the rice fields, smash everything to bits and start all over again. Just as psychotic as the Great Leap Forward, really.
So the Great Leap Forward was before the Cultural Revolution?
58 to 62. And the Cultural Revolution was in the early 70s, the same time as Kissinger went over there and made his case to Mao that let's have a little partnership here. Never mind the fact that we've been fighting communism tooth and nail for all this time. So who did what? Well, it was America who came up. Well, a certain sector of the American corporate elite who came up with this idea, and Mao did not allow it. It didn't occur until he died in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping realized, like, we've got to do something here and allow some sort of marketplace commerce to go on, as long as we have a death grip over business, politics, the army, and everything else. We control every iota of life in China. So yeah, an awful lot of money has been made. But what people really should know is that the corporate salaries, as a result of the resulting profits, have gone up, depending on your source, between 300 and 900%. So your boss, used to make 10 times as much as you. Now he makes 1,000 times as much as you.
Kind of like the United States of America.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's exactly that. Isn't it? The only people in China who have gotten rich are the CCP, the Communist Party, and the business leaders that kowtow to them, and the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. You don't trifle with these people. So, who has benefited from this arrangement? Well, the corporate American elite, the Communist Party in China, diametric opposites on the political scale. And who has become the patsy? Who's the chump? Well, ordinary people in North America who have become absolutely addicted to consumerism, because they have no other source of joy or hope in their lives, because the cost of living has gone up so much that no one can afford to buy a house anymore. The American dream, getting married, buying a home, having a family, getting ahead, all of that flushed down the toilet. So now what we have are, all these deaths by despair, because everyone's addicted to opioids now. The Chinese have got their revenge.
Not only opioids, but television is a pretty powerful opioid. That I believe the average American watches 4.5 hours of television a day.
Well, I have a whole
American television, for the most part, is pretty mindless.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as a travel writer, I divide my travels into two: meaningful or meaningless. And I don't do the meaningless ones. I don't need to get drunk on the beach in Cancun. There's far more interesting things to do. But there's an entire chapter in my book about not only drug addiction, but addiction to materialism. For instance, in my house, well, I've actually retired and I'm downsized now, but we had this lovely little craftsman cottage for many years. Little picket fence, cherry tree in the backyard, front porch, lovely little thing. No cupboards. You come in the front door, there's no place to hang your coat. There was 2 cupboards in the whole house, little ones in the basement or in the bedroom. In the old days, in 1912, when my house was built, people had 2 pairs of shoes, one for church and one for going to work. Now the average American has 30 to 40 pairs of shoes, and God only knows how many dresses and coats and everything else. And we spend our life in Walmart looking to find happiness through consumerism, which has been identified as a deadly addiction because the vast amount of money that has been transferred from east or west to east is incalculable. The book is all about all the countries I visited, and every single place I've been, from Los Angeles to Switzerland, the Chinese are buying it all. The amount of money, it runs into the hundreds of trillions of dollars. And everywhere I've been, Vancouver, the cost of living has quadrupled. I think it's 5 times as much, but I'm not sure. Is that quintupled in the last 10 years?
Well, Vancouver, the Canadians had an interesting policy when the British handed Hong Kong over to the Chinese. I believe the Canadians let the Chinese in if they could show that they had $100,000. Does that sound about right?
No, it was $250,000.
$250,000. Okay.
And the banks, the Canadian banks, were complicit in it, saying, we'll launder all this money, no questions asked. Eventually, the government came to its senses and stopped doing that, but that didn't stop the Chinese from merely just buying up the country through real estate. It's illegal to export more than $50,000 a year from China, but it's a piece of cake. You go to the payday loans company, you hire a bunch of people, or the criminal triad groups, and they do 10,000 at a time. They do it all day, every day, and it takes a month to transfer $5 or $10 million. And all of that is washed up on the shores of Vancouver. So, where it used to be able to buy a house, you now, to qualify for a mortgage, need to make a minimum of $250,000 a year just to talk to the bank.
Unfortunately, it's becoming that way in the United States of America. The average person cannot. This is kind of interesting. A friend of mine grew up in the West Village. And one day he was walking by the house that he grew up in. And his mother was a teacher and his dad was a journalist for the New York Times. And they owned a brownstone in Greenwich Village. And I guess he saw the real estate agent and talked to her, and she let him in the house. He told her this, I grew up in this house. And he said it didn't look like humans lived there, and it was selling for $10 million. So there is no way. I mean, even if humans did live there, there is no way that a school teacher and a New York Times journalist could buy a house that's worth $10 million.
I lived for several years in California, north of San Francisco. I have friends who still live there. Used to be $900 a month for a 1-bedroom. Now it's $4,000. And the kids from Silicon Valley making all that money can afford to rent. But if you're not making a couple $100,000 a year, and it's not San Francisco, it's all over, everywhere I've been. It's amazing. I went to Sydney, Australia. Friends living there. We went out for pizza, and it cost twice as much as it did in Vancouver. I said, "How's this possible?" And he said, "Well, the whole country has been bought up by the Chinese. It's everywhere. It's everywhere where I've been."
So how are the Chinese getting this capital to buy up the world?
They're getting it from us.
But,
we're transferring all of our money over there.
But why are we doing that?
Mindless. We're trying to make ourselves happy through shopping. And there is a section in my book talking about endorphins, that the brain, it produces an endorphin from anticipation, expectation, and results. So you think about shopping, it makes you happy. You go shopping, it makes you happy. You use the product, it makes you happy. And just like cocaine, it wears off. So you do it again, and you do it again, and you do it again, and you keep doing it. And the amount of money that has gone from North America to China, I mean, you just couldn't begin to count it all. So a great many of the wealthy Chinese business people don't trust their communist government any more than we do. So they transfer all their money back here by buying up our property. You couldn't even begin to look at the cheapest property in Vancouver for less than 1.7 million. That's a teardown. That's just to tear it down. And all of the investment that I've seen, well, 99%, has been Chinese. So you're not seeing any Russian money, American money, or European money coming in here. And the entire west side of Vancouver is now, the schools are Chinese, the houses are all Chinese, and they're all multi-million-dollar houses.
My cousin has told me that there's a gang problem there, possibly triads, which I thought was kind of interesting, that Chinese organized crime came to Vancouver.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And this is kind of interesting. I was interviewing the former head of the Lucchese crime family. His name is Anthony Gaspipe Casso. And he told me a lot of tales. I interviewed him at the Supermax federal prison in Florence, Colorado, where the guys that the United States has the most antipathy, the 400 guys that the United States has the most antipathy for are at this prison. And Kaczynski, the Unabomber, has been there, and Ramsey Youssef has been there. Tim McVeigh has been there. But what's really interesting to me is so this guy is the boss of the Lucchese crime family, and he is working something out with people in Arizona and a guy named Henry Ho. And Henry is a member of the Triads, but also in the Communist Party. And they're building, and this is after NAFTA, so they're building factories in Mexico so they can avoid the tariffs that the United States would impose if it was a NAFTA. So that always was kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, triads have been around in China for hundreds, if not thousands of years, criminal gangs like the mafia. And some would say that they go all the way to the top of the Chinese structure, that China is basically run by criminal gangs. I don't know China well enough to know that. But yeah, the triads have been in Vancouver for quite some time, especially recently. Aside from my book, there was a bestseller in Canada last year called Willful Blindness, senior reporter Sam Cooper. And basically he said the provincial government in British Columbia turned a blind eye to all of this money coming in, and a massive amount of it was drug smuggling and money laundering. There's a scene in the movie Scarface, Al Pacino back in the 1980s, where his gang pulls up in front of the bank and they unload all these hockey bags, duffel bags stuffed full of cash. And the bank manager runs out and helps them, but come on in. And that was happening in Vancouver at the Hard Rock Casino day in and day out, where guys were walking in with millions of dollars and laundering it all, and then taking it and it was being, put into drug smuggling. These days, the Mexicans are indeed involved because the Chinese are shipping their precursors of fentanyl to China or to Mexico and working with the gangs there who are importing it into North America.
Yeah, fentanyl's become quite the scourge in the United States. Is it bad in Canada? Are there a lot of people dying of fentanyl overdoses in Canada?
Well, in America and in Canada, more people have died from fentanyl than died from COVID. I just came back from a walk. I live in a beautiful section of downtown Vancouver, right on the water. And I can't go for a 10-minute walk without seeing a body lying on the sidewalk. I just saw two. You don't know if they're dead or not. Sometimes I go to into a store and say, call 911, or I go talk to the drug people who try to help these drug addicts. And it's everywhere. Oh my God. Yesterday in the rain, I walked for 6 blocks on, and every block there was a guy fixing and shooting up or snorting through pipes. People just turn a blind eye to it. It's everywhere.
And China is definitely providing the Mexico gangs or cartels with these precursors, these fentanyl precursors. Why do you think our government hasn't stepped in and done something about that?
Oh, I've tried. But it's so profitable. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party runs every single aspect of life in China. If they wanted to close the factories down, they would. But there's far too much money being made all along the line. But more importantly, and this is in my book, and you can read it. It's been printed and stated. Li Shiping basically said to the Chinese Communist Party, "It is our role to become the leader of the world, take over and destroy Western democracy." And found one of the best ways to do it is to get our revenge from when they ran opium down our throats. We're going to run fentanyl down their throats. And they are certainly been successful because people are dying in droves.
It's interesting. And I think it was 1998. It was many, many articles ago, but I wrote an article about there were two Chinese businessmen, one set up in Los Angeles and one set up in New York. And if you needed an organ, these guys would give you an organ. I mean, if you're AB negative, I believe that's 1.5% of the population. It can be difficult to get an organ. But if you wanted an AB negative heart, if you want an AB negative liver, if you want an AB negative kidney, these guys would, boom, give you an AB negative organ. And what was happening is prisoners in Chinese prisons were tissue type. And they were, an order would come in and they would simply shoot one in the back of the head and harvest their organs. And I thought to myself, the US government is reptilian, but it's not nearly as reptilian as that. we just work our prisoners and pay them very little. We're not harvesting their organs. But that's the kind of callousness. I mean, callousness is kind of euphemistic there. But that's kind of callousness we're dealing with the Chinese.
Well, yeah, well, prisons are one thing. There's an awful lot of people in prison in America, but they cost money. It costs you $100,000 a year minimum to put somebody in prison. So China has perfected a model not only of harvesting human organs, but for instance, trials, judges, sentencing, all of that is out the window. They don't bother with that anymore. We have DoorDash, skip the dishes. They have execution vans there. They're small school buses, and they simply pull it up in front of your house, and you get in the back. They execute you, and they throw the body out the back. Off the top 10,
you've seen this. How are you privy to this?
Oh, it's easy to find. You just look it up. Execution vans. All the statistics are there. And China leads the world in executions. I think it's basically 7,000 a year. But the top 10 crimes in China are not robbery and murder and what you would expect. Every last one of them is insulting the government or, creating a protest or writing something that the government doesn't like. So when you do that, you simply disappear. And, harvesting of organs is just one small aspect of the callousness that the Chinese have shown towards just even their own people. The Uyghurs up in, the Muslim generation or culture in Northwest China, there's over 1 million Uyghurs in re-education camps, which is a modern term for concentration camps. They're in prison and they're churning out garments for us. We don't know where our genes come from, but these people are chained to these factories and cranking out goods for us. So, if you mess with the CCP, there's a price to be paid.
There was when the Japanese invaded the Chinese in the 30s and 40s, there were two main forces. There was the Chinese military under Chiang Kai-shek, and then there was the communists under Mao. And although the United States backed Chiang Kai-shek, Mao ultimately won everything. And then the Chiang Kai-shek ended up in Taiwan. And that government, generally a military dictatorship, although it's lessened in recent years. But why do you think that mainland China just doesn't take over Taiwan? I mean, people have been talking about that forever.
Whoa, that's the beginning of my book. That's where it all starts. I had a press trip to Taiwan. I've been there many times. And there was a Korean reporter on the press trip who had to go on assignment to a place called Kinmen Island. It used to be known as Quemoy back in the day when Taiwan was known as Formosa. And Kinmen is right off the Chinese coast, just a stone's throw away, but it's part of Taiwan, as our other islands in the South China Sea belong to Taiwan. And when Chiang Kai-shek was chased out of China by Mao's forces, Mao's team started bombarding Kinmen Island with an enormous, amount of artillery, a huge barrage that went on for years. And the Kinmen people, to not being blown to bits, dug up the whole island and built an underground city. And some genius decided that this could become a tourism attraction, just like American GIs going to Vietnam to see the tunnels that Charlie hid in back during the war. And that's why I was invited to go there. But that's when I found out all about the Cold War, which started in 1956 in Kinmen Island as the Chinese attempted to invade. And the barrage went on for quite some time until, guess who showed up? The U.S. Sixth Fleet, and said, enough of that. You're not crossing the water. And to this date, the Chinese have been trying to come up with ways to actually invade Taiwan, but the United States has an agreement with Taiwan to supply them with military assistance.
Because when Communist China starts beating its chest, the United States Navy generally has maneuvers around Taiwan. I've always found that interesting, but there are so many Chinese. I mean, they could essentially walk on top of each other and walk over to Taiwan.
Yes.
But so how long do you think the U.S. is going to underwrite Taiwan as a protectorate?
That's a very good question. I have some fellow journalists who've been following the story and reading my book, and have been sending me essays from reputable magazines suggesting that China is no longer today as strong as it was just a couple of years ago, that Xi Jinping's status is a little bit shaky. For instance, 20% of youth under age 25 are unemployed. 20%. And the real estate and manufacturing systems are no longer booming. And if the CCP and the People's Liberation Army actually overran Taiwan, there would be very serious economic consequences. For instance, Taiwan leads the world in manufacturing microchips, which everybody needs. You can't do anything without a microchip these days. So
gotta love those iPhones.
Yeah. Well, I'm beginning to wonder. I mean, I have been there and written, and I've met with the Chinese ambassador here several times in Vancouver. And what I would say today, if I had another meeting, was, you're not Ukraine. The Ukrainians, I mean, they'll fight tooth and nail. They'll fight to the death. I've talked to a lot of young people in Taiwan who they don't want to go in the army. And quite frankly, a lot of them couldn't win a wrestling contest. They're not Ukrainians. The army is not a vocation that people turn to in Taiwan. It's more of a high-tech, very highly intelligent, highly educated workforce there. So, yeah, if the communists wanted to go in there with all the stealth bombers and aircraft carriers and everything else that they've been spending our money on, they could do so. But as long as the Americans say, no, you can't do that, I don't think they will, at least not right away.
So the United States has a consumer culture. We're fond of our plasma TVs and other accoutrements like that. And China keeps cranking them out. Why do we not impose heavier tariffs on China? What and I'm talking, when I say we, I'm talking the United States. Why do you think that is?
Oh, it's quite clear. Very clear. A boycott could easily work, and it would not be that difficult to start. It already has started in some ways of tariffs on various products, although not a boycott on made in China stuff. I've been boycotting made in China for a decade now. But there's another iron in the fire here that no one wants to talk about. And that is that ever since this relationship between China and America began so many years ago, China has been buying up American treasury bonds by the trillion. And if the Chinese economy goes down, America goes with it. So the two economies are intertwined in an incestuous fashion right now, that the American government, the current one, is trying to find some way to extricate itself in certain ways. But if you pull the plug now, well, there's $1 trillion worth of treasury bonds that would be worthless tomorrow. So you got to be careful how you do these type of things.
So we're afraid of their monetary power. And is that why we don't raise the tariffs on the Chinese?
Well, there's a great many reasons, economic, cultural, whatnot. If you told the average American that you have an addiction problem, I don't mean fentanyl. I mean, your whole life is spent in front of the TV or shopping or whatever. Your life is mindless. You're not trying to save for a house anymore. You're not trying to get ahead. You don't even have any hope for the future. You can't go out and tell people that. I mean, I just want to step back a little bit here, saying I'm Canadian. I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and my idol, I mean, we had some fat, pudgy, old, stupid prime ministers during the day, but my idol was John F. Kennedy. Ask not what your country can do for you. Man, that guy was a rock star. And he influenced so many people. America was skyrocketing into the future. Progress. We're going to put a man on the moon. We're going to solve cancer. We're going to do all this stuff. And you don't have that anymore. Where's the hope for the future?
Well, it didn't work out so well for John Kennedy. His idealism. But what do you think of the current administration and how they're dealing with China?
Well, I've been asked that a lot. And what I'm going to say is, well, obviously, I'm a Canadian, and it's not my place to be commenting on American politics any more than you should start telling Canadians to get rid of your prime minister and get a new one.
Well, you've written this book, and that question pertains to your book, I believe.
Yeah, well, the book is not just about America; it's about the world.
I get that.
Yeah, and it's basically a lot of it has got to do with Canada. So we have some serious problems here, politically. If the current administration fell, and people get sick and to death of having the same leaders on and on and on, well, we have the competition, the opposite side of the coin, that wants to do some things that are not what I would call progressive or forward thinking. The leader of the opposition was against vaccines. I mean, can you spell stupid? There's a huge article in the paper today about how Canadians led the world in lining up for vaccines. We're highly educated. We understand what a vaccine is. It's not poison. It's what saved the planet. So, when you have the leader of a major political party saying, oh, vaccines are just a way for the government to control you, this particular politician supported the yahoos, the truckers, who invaded the capital of Ottawa and put a siege to the city for a month. I mean, come on. Nobody wants to go that direction.
Let's step back from that. And there's some antipathy towards the Chinese because of COVID. And our government, the U.S. government, is even conceding that it came from a laboratory in Wuhan. And now, I'm not saying that they did it intentionally. I'm saying it did come from a laboratory in Wuhan. There's a tremendous amount of proof for that. So there's that antipathy towards the Chinese over COVID. And what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm sorry. I really am not convinced that it came from a lab. I think it's far more likely that it came from the raw meat that the Chinese eat, the poor people, on a regular basis. They don't go to fancy supermarkets. But if you look at SARS, Ebola, avian flu, swine flu, it's all come from people eating animals. And that's another thing that we have to stop doing, because this particular crisis, this pandemic, was spelled out clearly 10 or 15 years ago that it was guaranteed to happen. So it doesn't really make any difference to me if it came out of a lab, or actually it's worse that it came out of these raw meat markets, because we continue to eat raw meat. And we've come very close here in Canada to, well, we had avian flu. Thankfully it was stopped in its tracks, but can you imagine another global pandemic on the heels of the last one?
So economically, let's look at Walmart. Walmart has done very well. And fleecing its employees. And providing very cheap products for Americans. So I was in Southern California in April, and I hadn't been in a Walmart in a long time. And I walked into this Walmart. It was huge. It was the size of a football field. So tell us about the synergy between China and these consumer goods that we buy at Walmart.
Yes.
That we're
synergy.
so fond of at Walmart.
Well, I'm not going to take my hat off to Sam Walton, but he started off at a little 5 and dime store. Some people say he started selling trash off the back of his pickup truck to trailer trash. He started pretty small. But just like Howard Schultz in Seattle came to the realization that people would pay a bundle for a cup of coffee, not 25 cents, they'd actually fork out $5 for a good one. Sam Walton realized that for many people, price is everything. And he was correct in that fact. And he made his mark by underpricing every other competitor in the market, even if he lost money doing so, because he drove his competitors out of business. There's an entire chapter in my book about Walmart saying,
I saw that.
Yeah, well, I estimate, I get my sources, from reading, but I estimate that Walmart has destroyed at least 250,000 small businesses all across America. No one can compete with Walmart, and they set up their superstars outside of town so they don't have to pay any taxes, and they don't pay proper wages. And the people who act as greeters at the front door used to own a hardware store and sponsor the girls' softball team. And right now it's a one-way street with Walmart. It all goes to one source, which is the Walmart family, the richest people on the planet, probably the richest people in human history. And they do nothing for anyone except destroy businesses. And in many locations, the superstore has done such a good job of destroying small towns that itself goes out of business because there's no one left has any money to buy anything.
So how does China factor into that equation?
Well, they don't pay their employees anything. When you reduce your labor costs 90%, it's pretty hard to compete with that. And so instead of paying somebody on this side of the water $20 an hour, they pay them $1 a day. So they can export their products at a price that no one can beat. That's why a lot of jobs have gone to Mexico. Why pay people $20 an hour when you can pay them $2 an hour? So it's all about offshoring, globalization, lowering your labor costs, and increasing the profits of the people at the top of the scale who devised this plan, who are laughing their heads off because all of them have their own private jets now. They have their own private pilots. They have a mansion and golf courses all over the place, and they do nothing to earn it. But since the profits of their company have skyrocketed, then they're being compensated for it. So, lucky for them, but not so lucky for the rest of us.
Now, Chinese billionaires are starting to emerge at a fairly high frequency.
Yeah.
What does it take to be a billionaire in China?
Good relations with the government. Basically, the whole country, as I'm told, run by 20 families, which is not much different than the chapter in my book about Yale University and its secret society called Skull and Bones, because more presidents and directors of CIA and foreign affairs have come out of that one small club than any other source on the planet. So you can say that there's a very small percentage of
three presidents and I think one director.
Well, it's in my book. I don't have it memorized, but that one small club has had a very, very strong effect on American foreign policy when it comes to China.
That, for sure.
Yeah. So, they're doing pretty well. But the rest of us are being treated like patsies.
So let's say you want to be a Chinese billionaire. What do? You go to the party and say, I've got this idea? Because a lot of industry is coming out of China. If you go to the government and say, I've got this idea and can you back me? Or do you get it rolling? And then the government says, this guy's doing a good job. Let's help him. Let's not harvest his organs. I mean, how does someone become a billionaire in China?
Well, I'm sure there's some people on this side of the pond who know all that stuff. I'm not one because I have not spent my life in China figuring out how the system works. But the Chinese people that I've interviewed here in Canada say they had to buy their job in China. For instance, a guy working for IBM, he said, it's going to take me the rest of my life to pay back that. The level of corruption in China is beyond all belief. Everything is bought and paid for. But if you're connected to the right people, then you can go upwards and onwards pretty fast. In fact, I've heard that there are more millionaires in China than there are now in America. But 90% of the population is poor still. And what stunned me when I was in China was to find out that only 7% of the population belongs to the Communist Party. 7% of the country is communist. The rest hate the government. As far as I know, they watch everyone like a hawk. If you've got a cell phone, and everyone does, they can tell if you go out your front door or your back door. They can trace every foot that you've walked in the course of the day. You open your mouth there, you disappear. So, you want to talk about corruption? Well, it pervades every facet of Chinese life, as far as I know.
Around 2005 or something, I can't remember exactly. Falun Gong was a religion or cult that emerged in China that went up against the government, and they didn't do so well. And they came here, and I wanted to write an article on Falun Gong's Grand Poobah, and I was invited to this very, very nice apartment on the Upper West Side. And the Grand Poobah wasn't there, but they tried to brainwash me. They were telling me about all the benefits of joining Falun Gong. And I said, well, I'm not really into that. But I was kind of disappointed that it was under false pretense that they tried to brainwash me. And I don't really want my brainwashed by cult members, just a personal preference. But did you come across the Falun Gong revolution at all when you were researching China? Have you talked to people in Falun Gong?
They don't really exist in China. They have a bad habit of disappearing if they do their thing over there. Here in Vancouver and across North America, they have a newspaper called the Epoch Times.
Yes.
Yeah, I read a few in there, and I just tossed it in the garbage. It just seemed like a bunch of rubbish to me. Yes, there are Falun Gong people doing their Tai Chi maneuvers out in the parks and everything. I don't really know enough about Falun Gong to have any opinion.
So where are we going to go in the future with China? What moves is China going to make at this point? What's your prognosis, your prognostication?
Well, when I first started looking deeply into this subject several years ago, there was a book called Claws of the Panda. Claws, panda being a cuddly animal, and the truth being, the Chinese bear is not so cuddly at all. But they operate on 5-year plans and have since 1949, and they plan well ahead. So what is happening now was planned a long time ago. But it wasn't until Xi Jinping became leader that they took off the gloves. It was called soft power. You didn't see what they were doing, never noticed it. Busy buying up the planet when you didn't know what was going on. But when Xi came to power, everything changed. He said, from now on, we're going to tell people what to do. We're going to tell the Western world who's in charge. And it's no longer soft power. It's hard power. But as Putin just found out in Ukraine, sometimes things don't go your way when you invade. Maybe everybody else is going to lend the Ukrainians a lot of weaponry, so you're in a stalemate. But you can't write a book and have any sales with a bad ending. So I sat on this book for quite some time, and people said to me, "That's depressing." Well, one of the
my books are depressing too. So
well, no, but the first 2 or 3 reviews that have been sent in are about my sense of humor. They said Michael somehow manages to alleviate the bleakness of the subject matter by making jokes about himself. So yeah, I mean, it's partly funny, but I didn't have an ending. So the book just ends with all of this information for people to absorb. And I'm getting emails from reviewers saying, "My God, I never knew any of this stuff." So at least it's educational. But the ending that I came up with as an afterword, I had to find something uplifting. And I said, what's been happening in just the last year or so? I mean, I can't turn on the TV without typhoons, droughts, hurricanes, scorching weather. I wrote a book in 2002 in California about global warming, which I believe was the first of its kind ever published in America. It's 21 years ago. And everything I wrote about now, I said by 2020, you watch. Well, it's coming. So what I'm saying is we can't continue to rape Mother Earth. We can't continue to foul the skies, eat all the fish in the ocean, dig big holes in the ground, and continue what we've been doing to make money. We're killing the planet.
Well, I understand what you're saying there, but how does China play into that as far as your prognostication? I mean, all of the money, the thesis is that China is going to buy everything. Now, is that going to happen? I mean, what's your prognostication? What's your timeline on that?
Well, that's past tense. That's already happened. Read the book. They bought up everything. But that's not the problem. You can't roll back the prices. I mean, it costs you $2 million to buy a house, whether you like it or not. It's not going backwards. However, there's one thing that China has to do, and we all have to do. China cannot continue to pollute itself to the extent it's doing now. We are facing an existential crisis in the world, which means the world as we know it is going to end. When the glaciers all melt, and they're 80% gone now, 20 years from now, the freezer will be gone, and the freezer is connected to the fridge, and the fridge is where we get our water from. No water, you cannot exist. So we're going to have to change our ways, and that's consumerism. I mean, consumerism is a brand new phenomenon. It's been only been going on for 20, 30 years. You cannot continue to do this. And there are ways to start chiseling away at it, like carbon taxes and tariffs. And you can't do it all at once because it would cause a catastrophe. But we do, over the course of the next 10 or 20 years, have to listen to the scientists and say, this world is going down the tubes here. Let's stop this mindless behavior and start focusing on something that has some meaning.
But Americans, they like to watch their plasma television, and they like to eat really bad food. I mean, 60% of Americans are obese. So
yeah.
Is that going to play into China ultimately having hegemony? I mean,
well, I quote Mark Twain a lot, and much of my writing, a man of great humor and wisdom. And I also throw in a bit of Yogi Bear from time to time, Yogi being less sophisticated. And one of his sayings was, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So I learned more 20 years ago from a guy I was interviewing. He was a futurist at the time. He was $10,000 an hour to talk to him. Frank Ogden, highest paid speaker in the history of the National Speakers Bureau. And he said, you reporters, you're all the same. Whatever you're writing about, it's already happened. I make a fortune talking about what's going to happen next. So sharpen your pencil, start doing your homework. Where are we going? Because people would rather pay to know what's going to happen next. So for me, this book is my first crack at summarizing what's happened. Who did it? When did it happen? How did it happen? And why? And then going forward from there, because we can't continue to stay on the same path.
And America has unprecedented wealth polarization right now. The pandemic, millions of Americans lost everything. And I believe a billionaire was minted every day over the course of the pandemic. Does China have anything to do with the wealth polarization that's going on in the United States, or is that just something that our politicians have saddled Americans with?
Well, the entire agreement in the first place was cooked up by Americans, and the Chinese just sat back and said no, and finally they said yes. So I'm not going to point the finger at them saying that they're actively involved in day-to-day proceedings here in America, aside from the fact that they're importing all this fentanyl.
But how has Chinese importations and trade has it accelerated the wealth polarization in the United States? I mean, I'm an American, but I don't have any problems with a Canadian prognosticating about America.
Well,
I can be highly critical of America myself,
yeah, well,
although I
the
do
pa-
love America. Let me
yeah,
say that.
yeah, the wealth equalization or inequality is profound. And whenever you find throughout history that the same thing has occurred, ordinary people have a tendency to start to get upset. And you can look at the French Revolution as an example of that, off with their heads. But right now you're seeing massive protests in France and in England, like Brexit. How much did Russia have to do with convincing that the Brits that they'd be better off pulling out of all their trade agreements? How stupid can that be? But Britain is suffering greatly right now. Luckily, here in Canada, well, we are importing 500,000 immigrants a year, more than the rest of the world combined, 10 times over. And the government has said, we need these people. This is the road to the future. The economy will boom because of that. So we've missed a lot of the things that have affected America. 2008, Canada didn't suffer at all. You know why? All our bankers are Scottish. They wouldn't lend a dime to their mother if she had a cancer.
How has Canada saved itself and compared to the United States and in other ways?
Well, throughout geography and history, throughout time, Canada has been more of a collective nation, thinly spread across the border for 5,000 miles, built a railroad to connect the whole country. But we've always learned from way back that we have to actually work together collectively. Are we socialists? Yes. America hates socialism. America is all about the individual. And I think that's your downfall right there, because greed is not good. And might does not make right. I think the most important chapter in the entire book is set in the Galapagos when I talk about marine iguanas and Charles Darwin and the theory of evolution. And he wrote, and here it is, word for word, it's not the strongest or the most intelligent of the species that survives. It's the one most adaptable to change. And if you resist change to the extent that America has because of its leadership, well, you don't even have metric. You don't even have coin money. You don't have Medicare. You don't have all the modern things that any modern state has.
Well, we definitely have Medicare. We just don't have a single payer system, which is really, we rely on HMOs, which is quite the scam. We pay HMOs money to deprive us of healthcare. I mean, it is pretty amazing.
Okay, but here's the second half of the quotation from Darwin. His book came out in 1850s. He didn't publish it right away because in those days, everyone believed that the world was made by an old man with a beard who lived in the clouds, and it took 7 days, and it was 2,000 years ago. And you came out and talked about evolution, you could get executed. So he sat on his book for a while, but when it came out, the critics savaged him. Well, Herbert Spencer, the famous philosopher at the time, came out with the review, oh, it's survival of the fittest. Oh, dog eat dog. Oh, might makes right. And Darwin was horrified by that because the people saying that were justifying their slavery and purchasing of other human beings and all sorts of other filthy, nasty work, just by survival of the fittest. And that's what America is run by today, that philosophy, whatever you can get away with. You can't do that in other countries. You get caught.
Herbert Spencer had a extremely repulsive philosophy. It was basically social Darwinism. Yeah. And it ultimately led to, there was a tremendous amount of money from the Fords, from the Kellogg's, from a number of very powerful families that went into eugenics. And Herbert Spencer was one of the foundations of American eugenics, unfortunately.
Well, after Darwin's book came out, not too much longer, Robert Louis Stevenson, the most popular author in the world, came out with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll's a wonderful person doing experiments, and he comes up with one that turns into an animal, Mr. Hyde, this hairy, dark, monkey-like creature. So it was actually called devolution. It's no longer evolution. We go down Darwin's path, we're all going to turn into monkeys. So his philosophy was denied, but it's not a theory of evolution. It's a fact. So, his findings that it's not the most powerful of the species that survives. It's the adaptation to change. And there's an awful lot of people in America who are very wealthy and powerful who do not want to see any sort of change because they're doing very well.
Why do you think Canada is a kinder, gentler society than America? I've always thought America has much greater heterogeneity than Canada. And I've always thought that that played a role in Canada, because Canada doesn't have the heterogeneity of America. I always thought that that played a role in a more benign culture.
Well, Canadians are mocked in some ways for being so polite. You know, we're always saying, I'm sorry. We are basically well-mannered because that's a British tradition that we've learned from our parents. Behave yourself, you know, treat other people as you would like to be treated. But if you go back in history, the province of British Columbia, Vancouver, where I live, was only settled 150 years ago. Fur traders, French and British fur traders, and they got along very well with the Indigenous people. They treated them as equals. During the gold rush of 1860, after the American gold rush, all the Americans came up here, including a huge number of Civil War veterans, mercenaries, people paid by New York banks. And the very first thing they did was started slaughtering First Nations people. And the governor of British Columbia at that time said right off the bat, well, we got to stop that. We're going to become part of America. And we were invaded for a short period of time by people who wanted to take over. So, you know, you can either live in harmony
and return the favor in 1812. I think that they aided and abetted the British, burn down the White House. So.
Well, I've worked a lot with Indigenous people. I have a project whereby me and my colleagues bring computers, books, libraries, high-speed internet to the most remote and poorest remote First Nations communities here in British Columbia, because I'm a strong believer in literacy. But one thing we can learn from them after they're existing here for 10,000 years is to live in harmony with nature. Don't go around conquering everything all the time, climbing Mount Everest, you know, conquering this and being that. Learn to live in a way that is sustainable, so that, you know, you're not constantly destroying things, moving on to the next one. You know, growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell, wrote Edward Abbey many years ago. Growth for the sake of mindless growth leads nowhere. You got to learn to live, you know, in harmony with your fellow man and with Mother Nature. Otherwise, you know, bad things happen.
Well, Michael, it's been good having you on the Nick Bryant Podcast, and your book is Follow the Money, How China Bought the World. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, I appreciate coming on and having a fine discussion with you. And one thing I want to say, if I can close with, is that people have said the book is readable. It's not homework. It's not like going to school. There's a story there.
From what I've read of the book, I've really enjoyed it. I've been usually when I have a guest on, I try to read the entire book, but I've just been so busy this week that I haven't been able to. But from what I've read, I've really enjoyed it.
Right. Thanks very much.
And have yourself a good night.
Take care.